And we're back still doing what is truth. Again, we've done the first 5 points, and we are still on number 6, that truth does not equal science, and science does not equal truth. So that's the one we're working on. And last week, we ended up, I gave you an overview of what they call the dogma of molecular biology and the 4 basic functions of DNA. And what I said was that led us to the all-time greatest catch-22 here. That there's about 300 molecules required for these life-essential functions. So what happens here is, you need the DNA to make all these 300 molecules, but you also need these 300 molecules to make the DNA. And not only that, as we said, you need pre-existing DNA to make more DNA through the process of replication. And what I said was all this represents irreducible complexity. And I brought that up last week. We just started in on that. What I didn't tell you yet was that this term was coined by biochemist Dr. Michael J. Behe. And to remind you what we've said so far, what irreducible complexity means is that all the parts must be present together at the same time, functioning together, or none of this can happen. And then life can't happen. All the parts are equally necessary, so they have to arise and be present at the same time for the system to function. Therefore, you cannot develop the system gradually, because all the parts must be there together simultaneously. And I think I said, a car without the transmission does no good because it won't go, right? So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And even if the parts did develop randomly and gradually on their own, how did they all end up being encoded within DNA? That's a good question. So as you can hopefully see, irreducible complexity becomes a death sentence for evolution. And what you need to remember is that the 4 basic functions of DNA represent irreducible complexity on a massive scale. So what I really want you to get from the discussion last week is that transcription, translation, replication, and the recognition and repair of damage and errors are amazingly complex, intricate, detailed, choreographed. And actually what we did last week, I just scratched the surface, because there is so much more involved in these processes. But the point is, everything in the structure and functions of DNA, RNA, and proteins, everything in molecular biology is an example of irreducible complexity, because there is a ridiculously large number of components, subunits, parts, etc., that are absolutely required for life. And they must all be interacting, functioning together, knowing how the other parts function, reacting to that, and having the correct subunits to be able to interact. And they must all be there together at the same time, or life can't happen. And even though that's amazing and complex enough on its own, what's even more amazing is that all the information needed to make these processes happen, all comes from within DNA. They all require many separate parts to function as one, and for it to all work, and for life to be possible, and all that comes from DNA. And let me point out here, things just get worse for evolution, because when it comes to irreducible complexity, It's the norm in nature. Examples of irreducible complexity are commonplace. Countless examples of it exist throughout both the animal and plant kingdoms. And here's one that's often cited, one from bacteria. A great example is the bacterial flagellum. This guy is basically a water-cooled proton rotary motor that can spin at 100,000 RPM. It's just like an outboard motor on a boat. It's made of two gears, forward and reverse. It has a rotor, a U-joint, a drive shaft, a propeller, and a stator. And they all function the exact same way that the machine parts with those same names function. And without every one of these parts present and working together, the bacterial flagellum doesn't function. And within the concept of irreducible complexity, a gradual accumulation of these parts does an organism no good. Having one or two or even three of these parts without the others is useless. And the flagellum won't go. The bacteria won't go. So on their own, these parts are useless. They can't function independently. So they're useless, and by definition of evolution, they provide no adaptational advantage. Therefore, the individual subunits are useless, and they would be selected against by evolution. Evolution would select them out of the population. But it doesn't stop with just the presence of these parts. As you can tell, they all must be functioning together. They must be created in such a way that they all fit and align with each other in the proper arrangement in order for the whole system to function. Each unit must have a portion of it that can interact with the others, or the system won't function. So evolution has yet another problem. How can different subunits that would arise gradually, randomly, and independently know not only their own structural needs and functions, but also the structural needs to interact with and function in concert with the other subunits before they even exist? How can evolution create systems that have subunits that are able to fit and align with all the other subunits so they can work in concert with to create a functioning system as a whole when they come about gradually, randomly, and independently? Hopefully you see the problem in this for evolution. The fact is, evolution has no answer for irreducible complexity. And like I said, there are countless examples of it throughout life. In fact, they are an integral part of life. In addition to the bacterial flagellum, we could just mention a few other ones. The human eye, all the proteins, DNA, RNA, woodpeckers, the pressure adaptations of deep-sea fish, the breathing mechanisms of marine mammals, yaks, sea snakes, and on and on and on. They're not isolated incidents. They are commonplace, and they are essential to life. So the question here with irreducible complexity is, it's the which came first, the chicken or the egg thing, right? And the answer is all of the above. You have to go down to D and select all of the above. Everything had to be there at the same time for life to happen, which means that scientifically, life is not possible via evolution. But what I want to do now is focus on some more evidence from the four basic functions of DNA. And I want to again point out that one of the main reasons I spent the time explaining those functions last week is to emphasize the complexity, the details, the choreography found within these functions, to show you there are numerous components involved in these functions. And again, I just scratched the surface with this. There is so much more, like entire college courses more, right? So, keeping that in mind, let's look at what we learned from these processes, beginning with replication. That was the process of copying DNA. And we learned that DNA polymerase is the main enzyme involved in assembling the new DNA strand. It takes the next nucleotide in line, which base pairs with the next nucleotide in the DNA strand being used as a template, and adds that to the growing strand. And there's a bunch of other proteins that it works with while it's doing that. So, here's the point of this. Without DNA polymerase, this is critical, because without DNA polymerase and all those other proteins it works with, you cannot replicate DNA. And you can't replicate DNA because DNA nucleotides will not self-assemble. This is an absolutely critical aspect. They will not self-assemble. Now, moving on to the next one. Transcription, where DNA is used to make an RNA copy. And as we learned, RNA polymerase is the main enzyme involved in doing this. It takes the next RNA nucleotide that matches with the next DNA base in line that it would pair with, and it adds that RNA nucleotide to the growing strand. And as it does this, I mentioned there are other proteins that it works with. Once again, this is critical because without RNA polymerase and all the other supporting proteins, you cannot transcribe DNA into RNA. And you can't transcribe DNA into RNA because RNA nucleotides will not self-assemble either. You see a theme developing here? Well, here comes the next one. The next one we talked about was translation, where the language of DNA, through its bases, which are copied to RNA, is translated to the language of proteins, the amino acids. And we learned that ribosomes are the main player in translating the mRNA into a protein strand. And we learned that it reads the mRNA 3 bases at a time and matches the corresponding amino acid to what those 3 bases call for. And we also mentioned there are many other proteins and RNA molecules that it works with. Once again, this is critical because without the ribosomes and all the other supporting proteins and RNA molecules that it works with, you cannot translate mRNA into proteins. And you cannot translate mRNA into proteins because amino acids will not self-assemble either. DNA nucleotides, RNA nucleotides, and amino acids will not self-assemble. If you look down here, look at all my Legos again. We have a whole pile of Legos sitting there. And guess what? We can let those Legos sit here from now until eternity, and they will never self-assemble. They require an outside force. We have to pick them up and assemble them. On their own, they will sit here forever. They will never self-assemble. And the point of that is DNA, RNA, proteins, exactly the same scenario. They will not self-assemble either. Just like the Legos. DNA, RNA, and proteins require all the other players that we discussed and many more to assemble them for them. They have to be the ones doing it for them. Okay? You absolutely need those several hundred other proteins and RNA molecules, or these processes will not and cannot happen. All of these essential components are absolutely required. Folks, this is non-negotiable. This is science. This is what everybody knows, which has been learned from experiments and observations. Without all these components, none of these processes can happen. And if none of those processes can happen, then life cannot happen either, because none of these building blocks will self-assemble. They have to be put together by all the players that we discussed. They have to be, when they are put together by all these other players, they have to be linked and chemically bonded to one another through all the players that we discussed. And I'm trying to, hopefully you get, I'm trying to stress this point, because I want you to understand how critical this is. Without all these necessary components, all the machinery required for each process, all of it being there together, functioning simultaneously, without DNA polymerase, RNA polymerase, without the tRNAs and the amino acid complexes, on and on and on. And everything we talked about, plus so much more, without all that, please get this, the only option that you are left with for evolution to have started back in the supposed prebiotic soup is for DNA nucleotides to self-assemble into DNA, for RNA nucleotides to self-assemble into RNA, and for amino acids to self-assemble into proteins. That's the only option you have if you do not have all those components. And not only for them to self-assemble, but to assemble into functional and meaningful DNA, RNA, and proteins. But the problem is what I just told you. DNA nucleotides do not self-assemble. RNA nucleotides do not self-assemble. And amino acids do not self-assemble, because they do not have a natural affinity or an attraction for one another. As we said, it does not happen naturally. And DNA polymerase and all the other components that we discussed would not have been around yet. That's a problem for evolution. It is widely known that DNA and RNA nucleotides and amino acids do not have an affinity for one another and therefore will not self-assemble. Well, let me tell you some history of how we got there. In the 1960s, Dr. Dean Kenyon and Dr. Gary Steinman proposed the theory of biochemical predestination, which became a popular book that they authored by the same name, Biochemical Predestination. This was their attempt to explain the self-assembly of proteins and nucleic acids from non-living environments, such as what they want to call the prebiotic soup, given the right environmental conditions. Their theory proposed that the properties of amino acids and nucleotides cause them to attract to one another and to self-assemble. However, Dr. Kenyon's own research, as well as many discoveries of molecular biology since, disproved his own theory. What he discovered is that you cannot explain DNA, RNA, or proteins through natural chemical processes. Dr. Kenyon's own research, as well as that of many others, showed that nucleotides and amino acids do not have an affinity for one another and do not have the ability to auto-assemble. What was discovered, what is now widely known, is that amino acids do not have an affinity for one another, and nucleotides do not have an affinity for one another. They've never had it, and they never will. As we learn, DNA must be assembled into DNA by DNA polymerase and all the other components. RNA must be assembled into RNA by RNA polymerase and all the other components. Amino acids must be assembled into proteins by ribosomes and all the other molecules involved. So please get what this means. Evolution says nucleotides and amino acids did something that they do not do. Please understand that. Evolution says nucleotides and amino acids self-assembled, which is something that science has shown us that they do not do. And without nucleotides and amino acids doing something that they cannot do, then evolution cannot happen. Without nucleotides and amino acids being able to self-assemble, evolution cannot happen scientifically. Please understand this. As a result, guess what Dr. Kenyon had to end up doing? He had to abandon his own theory. And guess what? This is actually a really good end to this story, because he is now a proponent of life having a designer. In fact, he is actually one of the founders of the intelligent design movement, all because of what he learned from science. Now, let me once again at this point, this is a great time. I shared this quote with you before. Let me show this quote to you one more time. A summary of the Fourth Congress of the International Society for the Study of the Origin of Life. Klaus Dost made this following statement. For the first time, it has now been determined unequivocally by a large number of scientists that all evolutionary theses that living systems developed from polynucleotides, which originated spontaneously, are devoid of any empirical base. Let me translate that for you. He's saying what I just told you. He's saying this. A large number of evolutionists have jointly determined there is no data or scientific evidence to support that DNA and life itself could have originated spontaneously, because the fact is that nucleotides and amino acids will not self-assemble. That's what he's saying, what I just showed you. That's the data, they know it, and they admit it. Like I said before, in this one statement, they have admitted defeat and admitted that their theory is without a leg to stand on, because nucleotides and amino acids will not self-assemble. And without these building blocks being able to self-assemble, evolution cannot happen. But let's do something fun here. Let's assume for a moment that they could. like the evolutionists still foolishly believe. The evolutionists love to teach that form follows function. Okay? And what that means, from their perspective, is that when a new function is needed to create a new aspect of a new species, evolution provides the new form to accomplish it. So the newly required function comes first in their logic, followed by the evolutionary process which creates the new form needed to meet this required function. So what that means is, for an example, to become a bird from a reptile, you need wings. So evolution provides the wings. That's what that means. And all this is driven by survival of the fittest. The form gives an adaptational advantage, and those that have that win out. Those species survive, and the other species cease to exist and eventually die out. That's what they believe, okay? But the fact is that because none of the building blocks of life will self-assemble, that completely destroys this nonsense. For example, if it were the case where amino acids could self-assemble, then why do you need ribosomes? Where's the form follows function here? We know for a fact that ribosomes exist, and they're the ones responsible for assembling proteins. So if proteins can self-assemble, what was the evolutionary necessity to evolve ribosomes? What was the driver? Bottom line is there was none. What adaptational advantage do ribosomes provide? If the amino acids can self-assemble all by themselves. If that were true, if they could self-assemble, there is no need for ribosomes. And by definition, evolution would have selected them out of the population. This becomes yet another problem for evolution. And this also extrapolates to DNA and RNA. If nucleotides can self-assemble, where's the form follows function with DNA and RNA? Because we know that DNA exists and it directs the assembly of proteins. So if proteins can self-assemble, what was the evolutionary necessity to evolve DNA as the author and driver of all these processes? What? Let's see, where are we at here? Am I in the right place? Yes, I think I'm still in the right place. What adaptational advantage does having DNA author and direct the assembly of proteins if proteins can do it all by themselves? The fact is, if amino acids can self-assemble, there's no need for DNA. There's no need for it to be the author or the driver of it. And by definition, evolution would have selected DNA out of the population. See, we could do this all day, and it just keeps getting worse for evolution. But before I end today, I want to give you another impossible scenario for evolution. And keeping in mind that everything we've been discussing represents irreducible complexity on a massive scale. So for evolution to overcome these impossible dilemmas that we've discussed, consider this. There we go. Each of the 100 or more unique proteins that I've mentioned, and the 200 or more RNA molecules that are all essential for life, they would have had to evolve randomly, simultaneously, and independently of both DNA and each other. and yet contain the same sequence for the RNA as the DNA from which it was encoded. This would also have had to happen with each protein and RNA molecule fully knowing the functions of each other, the functions of DNA, and with the exact sequence and subunits necessary to function together. They would have all had to randomly, independently, and simultaneously evolve in a manner that would allow them all to fit together, interact together, and function together. Hopefully you're seeing the impossibility of this scenario, but let me fully make sure you get it. To drive this home, what would have, for this to have actually happened via evolution, it would be analogous to the following. To several hundred different tornadoes ripping through several hundred different junkyards and creating several hundred different and unique airplane parts that then after that came together on their own and self-assembled into a fully functioning Boeing 747, all on their own. Are we starting to see the impossibility of this scenario here? So not only would all the pieces have to be created by random forces in the manner necessary for them to be able to interact with one another and fit together and function together, they would all have to come together on their own and self-assemble on their own into a fully functioning Boeing 747. Yeah, that's the horse I want to back. As impossible as this scenario seems, it's even more impossible for those 100 protein molecules and 200 RNA molecules that we discussed to have evolved randomly, simultaneously, and independently of DNA and each other, and yet contain everything needed for them to fit together and function together, interact together. Therefore, the organized, intelligent, logical, ordered, choreographed, information-rich, and information-driven systems found in molecular biology absolutely require both intelligence and prescience during the creation of the structure. Life absolutely depends on it. Life depends on all the information stored, retrieved, and utilized from DNA. All the other parts, the RNA, the other proteins, etc., that are created from transcription and translation. So, you have to know all of this, and understand all of this. The DNA, all the other proteins and RNA that we talked about, how they have to function with one another, how they have to be made, etc. You have to know all the chemistry involved here. You have to know all of this stuff ahead of time in order to plan to strategically, intentionally, and intelligently use all of it in the design of everything that we've been discussing in molecular biology. And this is a critically true statement because this type of organization, intelligence, logic, order, choreography, information-rich and information-driven systems, everything in the life essential functions of molecular biology, all of it, it does not arise from randomness or a gradual accumulation of the many essential parts of the systems. Randomness and a gradual accumulation, which is the basis of evolution, does not create organized, intelligent, logical, ordered, choreographed, information-rich and information-driven systems and processes. Therefore, Randomness simply cannot account for irreducible complexity. Randomness and a gradual accumulation would actually prevent life from occurring because it would prevent the possibility of the essential functions of DNA and molecular biology because it cannot account for irreducible complexity. And I told you when we started this, I could spend a year talking on this, and I was not exaggerating because there is a lot more that I could share with you about this. But in the interest of time, and being fully confident that with what we've already discussed, that you're already seeing that evolution is scientifically impossible, I'm going to end this part of the discussion here. And next week we're going to move on, talk about something, another aspect of this that you've all heard about, but you've all been very misled on, mutations. So next week we are going to talk about that. So for now, we are going to call it a day.